You won't believe what this boy did to survive. It was terrifying. If you like videos like this, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and activate the bell so you don't miss any new stories. This story is similar to many others. However, few were as lucky as this boy. George was born at the end of a sweltering summer in a public hospital in South Atlanta. His father didn't even wait for the baby to open his eyes. He left with the visitor's wristband still on his wrist. White, light-eyed, a passing presence. He hooked up with Vanessa at a party. She thought it could be love. He just wanted one night. When she told him she was pregnant, he disappeared. He didn't even look back. He didn't want to know about the child or her, and since then, all George has known is the echo of absence, of struggle, of hunger, but he never complained. At 10, he understood that his mother cried in the bathroom so as not to scare him. At 12, he learned to defrost food while doing his homework. 14, he already knew when the water would be turned back on just by listening to the neighbors complain. And at 17, well, at 17, George had everything the world hates. He was poor, black, the son of a single mother, and too quiet for someone who carried so much inside. But he had a secret, an old yellowed notebook hidden among history books. There, he wrote everything he couldn't say out loud, his fears, his anger, his doubts. It was his way of existing in a world that tried to erase him. School was a kind of silent war, not because of the hallways or the rules, but because of what no one said. Out loud, the teachers were there, but they weren't. Earning little, being held accountable for everything, being blamed for students tired of hearing the world tell them they were a mistake. It drained any soul, so they limited themselves to repeating formulas, pretending to teach, and not intervening. George could be insulted in front of everyone, and no one saw it, because seeing takes work. And work is tiring, and they were already too tired. The students lived at two extremes. Some came from homes so broken that they studied as if fighting for oxygen. Others used school as an arena. Chaos, mockery, forced laughter, and shouting among. These were those who tormented George the most, not out of hatred, but because he was the mirror of what they feared to be. A boy who didn't laugh, who didn't try to please, who had nothing, but seemed to carry an invisible power. George was invisible. Until he opened his mouth. After that, he became dangerous. The teachers pretended not to see. The students pretended not to hear, and George pretended not to feel. But he did feel it. Every muffled laugh when he walked down the hallway with his worn-out sneakers. Every joke when he forgot. His lunch because he had no food. Every time they called him Mommy's GG, mocking the affectionate way his mother had dropped him off at school on his first day. Vanessa hugged him, adjusted his hood, and whispered, unaware of who was listening. Go on, Gigi. This is your last year. After that, you'll study at Grayson University. You'll be a successful doctor. They heard it. They repeated it. They twisted it. Since then, Gigi has ceased to be a term of endearment. It has become ammunition, and he became the target, the school bully. Brian took pleasure in pulling the trigger. Tall, white, athletic, arrogant. The type who grew up hearing he was the future, and he hated everything George was, because deep down, he knew he couldn't be. Hey, Mommy's Gigi, did you write any more? Poetry about being rejected today. The laughter echoed like stones. George lowered his gaze and took a deep breath. At that school, no one knew how to listen, but everyone knew how to hurt. George was just another black body trying not to be pushed to the margins, but he was already there, and it was from the margins that he would launch himself. Vanessa never had much time to dream. At 18, she was already carrying a tray in her hands and dark circles under her eyes. At 20, she was pregnant by a man she never wanted to see again, and she was still running around in a 24-hour restaurant where customers complained about the weak coffee and the manager barely knew her name. Time was not kind to her. Her hair, once carefully braided, was now tied up in a makeshift bun. Her hands, marked by burns from pots and pans, no longer had the same touch. Her eyes still. George was everything. The reason she endured another shift, another rude customer, another salary that didn't even cover her basic needs. Whenever she got home, she left her exhaustion at the door and sat next to her son, pretending to be less tired than she really was. Sometimes he believed her. Other times he didn't. "Have you had dinner yet, Gigi?" "Yes, Mom. It was good." It was a lie. The cupboard had only rice and an open packet of beans. George waited for her every night. He preferred to eat in silence, sharing crumbs and hopes. Vanessa tried to keep up with the bills, but the world gave her no respite. First it was the rent, then the broken heater in winter. George cried himself to sleep at night, and she cowered with guilt. With each new overdue bill, a new weight settled on her already hunched back. That's why she accepted money from a man in the neighborhood, a loan shark. He seemed kind at first, easy smile, soft voice. But the interest was cruel. It grew like weeds. And soon the 1,200 turned into almost 3,000. That night, Vanessa trembled on the phone. She couldn't hide it anymore. "I took out a loan, Gigi. It was to fix the heater and pay the rent. But the interest? He said that if I don't pay by Friday, he'll show up here." George was silent. His heart was racing. The air weighed heavily on his chest. He had never seen her so scared. That hurt more than any insult he had heard at school. How much? 2,700. By the end of the week, there was no way out. The restaurant didn't pay salaries in advance. Vanessa's odd jobs barely covered the grocery bill. And George was cornered. It was on the sidewalk, under a flashing streetlight, that an acquaintance from the neighborhood made him an offer. "Want some real money fast? Just deliver it. No one will even know." George hesitated. He thought of his mother. He thought of the notebook. He thought of what it meant. But in the end, fear won out. Okay, it was just one package, just one delivery, just once. That's how it started. Vanessa never knew. George hid the money in his sneakers, the fear in his chest, and the guilt in his pillow. But every time the light came on in the kitchen, he thought, "At least today she won't sleep in the dark." Vanessa, for her part, was suspicious. Mothers sense these things. But she didn't ask, because the last thing she wanted was to confirm a nightmare that already felt real. And so, in silence, the two continued to live, one trying to protect the other, both slowly sinking into a system that never wanted to see them stand. Vanessa's routine was a weary dance between broken shifts and crowded buses. She left home before sunrise and returned after midnight. Even so, she managed to make George's coffee on good days. On bad days, she left a note. "I love you, it'll be okay." At work, she endured the dirty looks from rich customers who didn't see her. They just demanded. Her back hurt. Her feet swelled. But she smiled, because if breaking into 1,000 pieces was the price to see her son whole, she would pay it. And even when the world treated her as invisible, she was for George the strongest presence of all. She was his home, his harbor, his strength, and maybe, just maybe, that was why he would do anything to save her. At the school where George studied, names became labels and labels became armor or wounds. In his case, it became a wound. The nickname GG began as a gesture of love. On the first day of school, when George was still too young to understand the cruel rules of social interaction, Vanessa accompanied him to the gate. She adjusted the worn hood of his sweatshirt, knelt in front of him, and her voice choked with affection said, "Go on, Gigi. You are my pride and joy. One day you will study at Morehouse College, remember the name? The College of the Greats." George smiled shyly and entered the school with the naive hope that the world was as his mother said it was, fair to those who try hard. But the others heard. They repeated it. They distorted it. What was a nickname became mockery. "Mommies." Gigi began to echo through the hallways with the acid taste of cruelty. At first, he tried to ignore it. He lowered his gaze, clenched his fists in his pockets, and pretended he didn't care. But words hurt. And when repeated enough, They start to stick to your skin. Did mommy's GG bring a snack today, or did he forget again? Some mocked, pointing to George's worn backpack. Hey, GG, did you write another crying poem in your notebook? Asked Brian, the boy who seemed to live only to humiliate others. Brian was the stereotype of success at school. White, athletic, always surrounded by noisy classmates. He lived with a chest puffed up with self-confidence that came from privilege and oblivion. Forgetfulness, yes, because he never had to think about whether there would be food for dinner or whether his mother would come home too exhausted to smile. Everything was given to Brian, and for that very reason he hated George, because deep down, he knew he would never have that same silent resilience. George was quiet, but not weak. When they mocked him, he thought of his mother, sweaty and exhausted, carrying 2 bowls of soup and a tray of plastic cups in a restaurant that treated people like objects. He thought of the shoes with holes in them that he hid with black electrical tape. He thought of the words he wrote every night, which had not yet found a voice. In the classroom, the teachers barely concealed their disinterest. Many were as tired as the students. In neighborhoods like this, school was more of a storage facility for young people than a place of transformation. Students came and went unnoticed, except for those who caused trouble. George, being quiet, went unnoticed even when he was humiliated in front of everyone. There were days when he came home with his soul in tatters but his face intact. He never told Vanessa what happened in the hallways. He didn't want her to worry more than she already did. He preferred to swallow everything in silence and pour it out on the yellowed pages of his notebook. And it was on one of those afternoons, sitting alone near the court, that George wrote a verse he never forgot. They call me mommy's GG, laughing, loudly to hurt me. But if they had a mother like mine, they would know what it means to resist. He didn't know it yet, but that verse would be the beginning of something much bigger, a seed planted in the midst of pain. Meanwhile, the days went on gray with the same dirty looks, the same laughter behind his back, and the same feeling of inadequacy. George didn't fit in that environment, but he didn't fit outside of it either. He was stuck between 2 worlds, that of survival and that of promise. On one of the worst days of the week, after a class in which the teacher ignored yet another verbal attack against him, George was walking down the hallway when someone pushed his backpack. His notebooks fell out, and the notebook with his verses slid across the floor and stopped at Brian's feet. What do we have here? Oh, look, Mommy GG's diary, he sneered. George tried to take it back, but Brian opened it to the first page and read aloud, I write so I don't die. Look at that. How dramatic, huh? Who do you think you are? Tupac? The laughter echoed, like gunshots. But George didn't move. He just took a deep breath, took the notebook from Brian's hand, and for the first time looked him in the eye. You don't understand now, but one day you will. And he kept walking, ignoring the laughter. For the first time, George didn't bow down. And that, more than any sharp retort, was what bothered Brian. That night, George wrote more, and with more anger, with more force. He began to transform his pain into structure. The verses began to rhyme, the stanzas began to gain rhythm, and without realizing it, George was no longer just a wounded boy writing about his own pain. He was beginning to find his voice. George was always good at hiding things. He hid his tears behind his glasses. He hid his tiredness by keeping his head down. He hid his hunger with excuses he made up during break time, but what he hid most of all was who he really was. School followed the same daily cycle. The jokes, the contempt, the muffled sound of laughter, the looks that ignored, that judged, that never asked if everything was okay. And amid these invisible routines, George kept walking as if the ground were about to collapse, as if each step were an effort, as if each morning were a test he had to pass, in silence. Most days he got home before his mother. He would sit on the floor of his room, lean his back against the wall and stay there for long minutes. He didn't turn on the TV. He didn't touch his cell phone. He just stared at his notebook. Sometimes he opened it. Sometimes he didn't. When he wrote, He wrote as if venting to no one. Today they pushed me on the stairs. No one saw or pretended not to see. Someone laughed. No one helped. Class started, and I continued, pretending. This was George's world. A world where he existed only within the pages he kept. A world where being invisible was his only defense. But silence had a cost, and that cost was beginning to weigh heavily. One day, when he got home, he found his mother sleeping on the couch. Her feet still in her shoes, her head hanging to the side, and her restaurant uniform stained with sauce. The TV was on a program that no one watched. The sound was low. Her breathing was heavy. George stood still for a few seconds, watching, feeling that woman who had said in no uncertain terms that he would go to college was slowly dying of exhaustion, and the world went on, as if this were normal. He went to the kitchen. There was some rice in the pot, already cold. He took a plate, divided it with the few beans that were left at the bottom of the package, and heated it up. He set aside half, left it on the sink with aluminum foil on top. He wrote a note. "Eat this before you go to sleep. I love you. Gigi." Then, he went back to his room, locked the door, and finally wrote with more anger than ever. Anger at the system. Anger at school. Anger at his father who was never there. Anger at his own powerlessness. He knew that writing didn't change what was happening outside, but it changed what was happening inside. In the following weeks, he started writing every day. Without exception, the pages piled up. He began to separate them by theme. School, mom, anger, future. Without realizing it, he was organizing his own feelings, as if he were constructing a speech. He didn't know yet that it was music, but he already understood that it was a weapon. At school, nothing changed. Brian was still unbearable. The teachers were still silent. The principal was indifferent. But George was no longer the same. Inside, something was growing. It was on one of those days during recess that a third-year student sat next to him in the courtyard. It was Marcus. He wore big headphones, clean sneakers, and had a neat haircut. George almost got up thinking it was another trap. "Relax. I'm not going to make fun of you." "Okay. I just wanted to say that I read some of your stuff in your notebook." "What do you mean?" Marcus took a folded sheet of paper out of his pocket. It was one of the pages George had lost the week before when his backpack was thrown on the ground near the court. "This is real stuff, bro. You can throw it away. It was just me venting." "That's what's good about it. When it's real." George didn't answer. He didn't know whether to be annoyed or curious, but he kept that conversation in his memory. That night, when he got home, he found his mother in her bedroom, poring over a pile of bills. "We're $300 short, Gigi." And the guy calls. Every day, she wasn't crying. She was past the point of crying. Now there was only silence. The same silence George knew so well. He hugged her. She didn't ask why, and he didn't explain. But there, in that short, tense hug, something was forming. Something that was not said but felt. Something that he would soon turn into words. George's school was like many others in the suburbs. An aging building, faded walls, bars on the windows, and an empty promise of change. They painted colorful murals on the outside walls, motivational slogans in the hallways, and posters about tolerance and inclusion in the classrooms. But all of this was just window dressing on a broken structure. Inside, the priority was not teaching. It was containment, management, surviving the day. Most of the teachers were exhausted, underpaid, overworked, discredited of being able to make any real difference. They arrived early, left late, and in between tried to teach without being swallowed up by indiscipline, bureaucracy, and frustration. For many, the students were just numbers. A code in a journal, a grade to be entered into the system. George was one of those codes, and that hurt him more than the nicknames. He wasn't a troublemaker. He didn't cause trouble. He didn't shout, but he didn't smile either. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't ask for help. And because of that, he didn't exist in the eyes of most of the adults who circulated there. The ones who stood out were the extremes, those who caused trouble and those who shone. Those in the middle, silent, suffering in silence, were ignored like an old rag on an empty chair. "George, do you have yesterday's homework?" a teacher would ask, always in a hurry. "Yes, ma'am." He handed over the paper, received a distracted nod, and returned to his seat. No one really read what he wrote, and if they did, they might have been surprised. The school also divided students into groups, albeit informally. There were the survivors, children of single mothers, of workers who saw education as their only chance to escape. They worked hard, stayed in the libraries, tried to keep their heads up. There were the disillusioned, young people, who had already given up on beating the system and just occupied seats. And finally, there were the predators, teenagers who fed on the pain of others. George hung out with all these groups. And among them, of course, were the same faces that haunted him day after day. Faces like Brian's and his friends, who seemed to exist only to keep others down. During a history class, when the teacher turned her back to write on the board, George felt a small paper ball hit his notebook. "GG from Mommy. Doctor. LOL. Keep dreaming, little man." George read it. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. He learned that responding only fueled the spectacle, and in that cruel theater he didn't want to be the clown. But his lack of reaction wasn't a lack of pain. It was self-preservation. At another moment, as he was leaving, he heard behind him, "Have you chosen your medical specialty yet, GG? Dermatology? Because your skin needs attention, huh?" Muffled laughter. George stared at the group for a second. Then he just kept walking. He felt the humiliation like a blow to the chest. But instead of exploding, he wrote, "School teaches me not to exist, not to draw attention, to walk among the broken pieces without making a sound." Once, a new teacher tried to interact with George. He called him after class and asked, "George, is everything okay with you?" "Yes." "You don't talk much, do you?" "I talk enough." "Can I see what you've been writing? I hear you write very well." George hesitated, but handed over a sheet of paper. The teacher skimmed through it and seemed impressed. But in the end, he just said, "Interesting. Keep it up." That was it. No guidance, no real praise, no suggestions for improvement. George put the sheet back in his pocket, and with it, his hope of being noticed. The school that was supposed to welcome him built more walls than bridges, and George knew it. He no longer expected to be saved by anyone. Not teachers, not principals, not classmates. He walked through the hallways as if crossing a war zone, attentively, cautiously, and always ready for the next explosion. But a seed was growing inside him, silent, steadfast. He didn't know it yet. But what they were ignoring in the classroom was going to make noise in the world. The cold that week seemed worse than usual. Inside the apartment, the window panes were fogged up on the inside, and the wind blew in through old cracks, as if it were a familiar visitor. George watched his mother move around the house with her, shoulders slumped, her gaze distant. It was nothing new. Vanessa had already told him. The debt to the loan shark, the $2,700, the despair. But now her silence weighed more than the words of that day. George had started making deliveries. Nothing big. Small packages, quick meetings, no questions asked. Leo, the guy from the street behind, said it was simple. Pick it up. Take it. Come back. Cash on the spot. And it was, at least in practice. But in his conscience, each delivery was a burden. He did it for her tired eyes, for the almost empty pot, for the sound of the old refrigerator struggling to keep up. It was for her that he had crossed the line he swore he would never cross. But now, seeing Vanessa with her hands on her head, poring over bills, George realized something. Nothing was getting better. "Mom," he called slowly, almost asking permission to enter that suffering. "I thought, with the money, the debt?" She laughed, a short, dry, almost bitter laugh. "Did you think it would solve it, that it would disappear?" George nodded, confused. He had already left enough money for at least half the amount. "I paid part of it, Gigi. The problem is that he doesn't accept part. He wants it all. And if it's not all, he charges double. Interest on top of interest. He said that's how it worked. And I accepted it. I accepted it because I thought I could work it out, that it would be quick, but… She collapsed on the sofa. Every time I give him something, he says that now the debt is bigger. That I'm late. That this isn't a bank, that there's no payment schedule, and if I don't pay, he comes. She looked at George with moist but steady eyes. And I don't want you involved in this. Wherever the money I found inside my Bible came from. I pretended I didn't see it, but I did. And Gigi, you can't lose yourself because of me. George didn't answer. He just lowered his head, but he knew he was already lost. Or at least walking in circles inside a dark forest from which he didn't know how to escape. Each delivery took him a little further away from who he wanted to be, but it brought him closer to a solution. That was the dilemma. A dead end where the right thing to do was to have no way out. That night he didn't sleep. Lying on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, he heard his mother's every breath in the next room. The tired breathing of someone who slept out of exhaustion, not peace. The next morning, Leo was already waiting for him on the corner. I need you for 2 more deliveries today, Gigi. 1 downtown, another out in the west side. Can you do it? George nodded, saying yes. Will the pay be higher? 200 each, 400 total. I'll pay you when I get back. George took the packages, a thick envelope and a bottle inside a package. He didn't ask. He never asked. Because knowing too much was risky, and because pretending he didn't know was easier than facing what he was doing. On the way, he thought about everything that could happen. About getting caught, about being recognized, about someone finding out. But he thought mainly about Vanessa, about how she pretended everything was fine, about how she smiled while drying her hands on her apron, about how she said, "Good job," to herself while serving tables that never left tips. He completed the 2 deliveries. He returned with the money in his pocket. It was heavy, sweaty, but necessary. That night, he entered the house quietly. His mother was already asleep. George went to the kitchen, opened the top cabinet and stuffed the wad of bills into an open bag of rice. He knew she would find it, and he also knew she wouldn't say anything, because there, between what is right and what is possible, lay the space where they lived. The package was light, but George felt as if he were carrying lead in his coat pocket. The instructions were clear. Go to 38 Square. Keep an eye out for a guy wearing an orange shirt and a white cap. Hand it over directly. No talking. No delay. The square was far away, in a neighborhood George knew little about. He took 2 buses and got off before the stop, as Leo always told him to. Get off early, never at the exact stop. Security measures that sounded exaggerated, until you understood the kind of people involved. The sky was turning rust-colored when he arrived. At first glance, 38 Square seemed peaceful. Children on the slide, ladies sitting on benches, street vendors selling corn and warm soda. But in the background, in a dimly lit corner near the court, a group was gathered in a circle. The movement was different. George approached cautiously. The sound of beats improvised on the mouth and palm filled the air. It was a rhyming battle, an old microphone, a scratched amplifier, and lots of people vibrating with each verse spat out in the middle of the circle. He stopped, hidden among the onlookers. He had never seen a battle like this live before. It was intense, electric, as if the street were spitting out truths in the form of poetry. Verses about abandonment, racism, faith, politics, survival. Everything he wrote hidden in his notebook. But there, out loud, he was so absorbed that he forgot why he was there. Next, who's coming? One of the MCs pointed to the crowd. Are you speechless today? Where's the courage of the hood? George moved as if the gesture were involuntary. He was wearing a cap, his face half covered, and yet someone saw the movement. Hey, you there, the quiet one. Come on over. Me? Yeah, show us what you've got. The circle opened up. The microphone trembled in his hand. His heart was beating in his throat. George took a deep breath. He thought about the notebook. He thought about his mother. He thought about the money he was already carrying. And he rhymed. Heart in my hand, package in my pocket, silence in my soul. But I let myself go living on the edge, with no choice. But in the middle of the square, I become a flying leaf. Every step a fear, every verse a relief. I'm rhyming life. My best trick. The Rio circle exploded. Screams, applause, surprised smiles. George blinked as if waking from a dream. He felt the ground more firmly. For the first time in days, he didn't feel like a ghost. But that's when he saw it. A man standing on the side of the square, orange shirt, white cap, sunglasses. His gaze fixed on him. Cold. Fixed. Time froze. George stammered, handed over the microphone, and hurriedly left the circle. The man was already coming toward him. You took your time. His voice was dry. There was movement here. Did you come to rhyme or to work? George held out the package. The man quickly grabbed it, looked around, and stuffed it into his backpack. Don't ever touch a microphone again when you have my stuff with you. Got it? George nodded. His hands were shaking. The heat of the circle was now cold in his stomach. The guy turned his back and disappeared into the alleys. George stood there, trying to regulate his breathing. The glow of battle faded within him. In seconds, he was back to being the boy who walked silently, fleeing from the eyes of the world. On the way back, he avoided glances, stops, and brightly lit streets. When he entered the house, he locked the door and leaned against it, as if the danger were still on the other side. Vanessa was on the couch, sleeping with her crumpled apron on her lap. George watched her for a moment. Then he went to his room, took off his sneakers, and lay down without dinner. On the ceiling, he saw flashes. The verse, the applause, the cold stare, and a certainty was born there. He was good. He knew how to rhyme. He knew how to express himself. He felt the words like someone who feels pain. But the life that forced him to sell what wasn't his was the same one that could steal his chance to be who he always was. He still didn't know what to do with that. But he knew he needed to go, back to that square. Friday arrived with the weight of an entire week on George's shoulders. He had returned late from 38 Square, his head still buzzing from the rhymes he had heard, and the strange feeling of having been part of it, even if only for a few scattered verses. During the day, he repeated the words he had created in his head, perfecting the silent melody that always filled his silences. At school, no one said anything about the square. No one knew. It was his. A secret. A fragment. A freedom that no one could mock because no one had seen it. On his way home, he passed by the corner market and saw the same group gathered there. Young people sitting on the sidewalk, some standing, others leaning against their bikes. They laughed, listened to music, shared headphones and beats. George hesitated for a second, but then one of the boys recognized him. Hey, it's you. The kid from the square. George stopped, surprised. You did well yesterday, man. I liked your vibe. It was different. Another young man, older, wearing a loose shirt and carrying a notebook under his arm, approached and said, You've got something in your voice. It's not just about rhyming nicely. It's about saying what you feel. That's rare. Are you going to the Lincoln event on Saturday? There'll be some producers there, people who really listen. George raised his eyebrow. Lincoln? Community Center. Saturday, 5 in the afternoon. If you want to show what you've got, show up there, just don't be shy. That scares the stage away. George didn't answer right away, but the invitation kept hammering in his head. That night, while helping his mother dry the cutlery and stack the dishes, she commented, The restaurant manager is thinking about cutting another day off my schedule. He said business has picked up, but the staff hasn't. George noticed her dark circles were deeper than usual. Her uniform shirt was starting to fade from overuse. She smiled, but her eyes were exhausted. Don't worry about it, Mom. Worrying is what I do best, Gigi. That word, Gigi. It had become a wound at school, but on her lips it still sounded like affection. He forced a smile, but inside he felt torn. He thought about Saturday's event and what he still had to do. Because earlier, in front of Leo's barbershop, the message had come bluntly. GG, there's an important delivery on Saturday. Abandoned terminal, 5 in the afternoon, don't be late. George froze. Same time, same day. If he were at Lincoln, he would be doing what he loved, scribbling verses in a world that might listen to him. But if he didn't go to the terminal, his mother's debt could turn into something much worse. He slept poorly that night. He dreamed of dark corridors, of voices echoing broken rhymes. He woke up sweating. On Saturday, the day started out muggy. The sky was opaque, as if it wanted to rain, but changed its mind every minute. George woke up early, took a shower without saying a word, and stared at the backpack on the chair. Inside was the package he was supposed to deliver. In another pocket was his notebook of rhymes. He looked at his watch. 3 in the afternoon. Vanessa entered the room with a cup of tea in her hands. "Are you going out?" He nodded. "Is it important?" George hesitated. Then he said, "Yes, very." She asked no further questions. She just watched her son as he adjusted his hood and left. George walked through the streets with a heavy heart. Each step toward the terminal seemed heavier than the last. When he got close to the railroad tracks, he stopped. He took a deep breath. He looked at the 2 paths. He turned left. He went to Lincoln. He arrived a few minutes before 5. The community center was full. People were scattered everywhere. Microphones were set up, speakers were booming. Young people with notebooks, cell phones, eyes shining with desire. George leaned against the wall, watching. The boy from Friday saw him and waved. "Thought you weren't coming." George took off his hood. Me neither. He grabbed his notebook. He walked up to the stage. He saw a boy rapping fiercely, drawing applause. He felt butterflies in his stomach. His hands were sweating, but his feet didn't retreat. When it was his turn, he gripped the microphone tightly. His voice faltered on the first 2 words, but then it came. Not like an explosion, but like a release, as if years of silence had found a tunnel to escape. And for the first time, no one laughed. No one interrupted him. That night, George wasn't Mommy's Gigi. He was just George, and that was enough to set the world on fire. George sat further back, a little away from the makeshift stage at the community center, with his notebook of rhymes on his lap. The space was simple. A few plastic chairs scattered around, speakers tied with electrical tape, and walls covered with faded posters from past events. Even with its precarious structure, that place breathed art, and on that night it breathed expectation. It was Saturday afternoon, and the battle at Lincoln promised to bring together strong voices. Attentive eyes turned to the small stage where the verses would decide everything. There were no trophies or fees, but there was something greater: respect. And sometimes someone important watching from the back row. George was there to watch, seated, notebook on his lap, as if he were just another curious onlooker. Inside, he was fighting a war. The invitation was still open. He could go up, he could show off, but he could also fail. Or worse, be recognized by someone from the other side of the life he led. And that, he wouldn't know how to handle. The clock read 6:47 p.m. He looked at his phone. No message from Leo, no sign of a charge. Nothing. The voice on the microphone announced the next duo. The audience cheered. George found himself pressing the notebook against his chest. His hands were shaking, but it was a familiar tremor. Not from fear, but from energy trapped for too long. 2 MCs took the stage and began trading sharp verses. The audience reacted with laughter, boos, and applause. Each well-placed line was a small victory. Each mistake, an invitation to oblivion. It was a battlefield where words were weapons, and the microphone was a temporary throne. George felt something different that night. It wasn't just nervousness. It was as if something was pushing from within, asking for passage. He leaned forward, took a deep breath, and closed his eyes for a few seconds. Someone leaned against him. It was the same guy who had invited him. Now, with a broad smile, "I thought you weren't coming." "I almost didn't come," George replied. "There's room for one more. The next round is open. Anyone who wants to can go up. Are you up for it?" George looked at the stage. At the people, at his notebook, and then at himself. He stood up. He didn't make a fuss. He didn't announce it. He just walked to the corner of the stage, where he would wait for his turn. 2 other MCs finished their battle. The audience was still commenting on the rhymes when the organizer looked at George and nodded. It was time. He went up. He grabbed the microphone. He looked around. The audience's first reaction was curiosity. Then, whispers. Who is this guy? He looks lost. He doesn't even look like an MC. But he didn't need a pose, he just needed silence. When the beat started, he took a deep breath. I didn't come to talk about what I have, but what I lack. What the world took from me. Without warning, without return. I'm tired of keeping quiet, of pretending that everything is fine. When the refrigerator cries, and so does my heart. The first line silenced the whispers. Some heads rose. 1 or 2 cell phones started recording. George continued unhurried. His voice was firm but loaded with something that cannot be learned. Truth. My mother serves coffee with tiredness and dignity, and I serve verses to see if I'm good for anything. Gil, they said the future wasn't mine, that the world wasn't mine. But if everything was theirs, why was I the one who hurt the most? When he finished, there were no immediate shouts. There was that rare second when no one knows what to say. After that, the applause came, not the loudest, but the most sincere. George stepped off the stage with his heart racing, and with a new certainty. There, he was someone. And in the crowd, man in a dress shirt, discreet, watched him closely. He didn't smile. He didn't applaud. He just stood there, arms crossed, like someone who already knew what he was seeing. Like someone who recognizes raw talent even before it is polished. He wasn't from the neighborhood. He wasn't part of the local scene. But he was there. And sometimes that's how it all begins. George didn't know it yet, but that night would not, like the others. What he had thrown into the world in the form of verse was now coming back in the form of opportunity, and nothing would be the same as before. That night, George returned home with headphones on, but without listening to music. The beat still vibrated inside him. The audience, the stage, the warmth of the dim lights. It was as if everything was still stuck to his skin. But there was something else. The look from the man in the back row. It wasn't just curiosity, it was interest. A kind of attention George wasn't used to receiving. He tried to push the idea away, to convince himself that it was just someone else from the community. Maybe an uncle of one of the MCs. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. Arriving home, he walked through the wooden door that creaked as it opened. Vanessa was sleeping on the sofa, her shoes still on her feet and her dirty apron crumpled beside her. The remote control lay on the floor, and the television was on at an almost inaudible volume. George covered her with a thin blanket and stood, for a while watching his mother's slow breathing. Even exhausted, she always waited for him. The next morning, the sound of the doorbell interrupted the rare silence of the house. George, still in his t-shirt, went to answer it without thinking twice. On the other side of the door was the man from the night before. "George," he said, taking off his sunglasses. George froze. "My name is Alan Moore. I work with music, managing new artists. Yesterday I saw you at the Lincoln Battle. You have something different." George was silent for a few seconds. His mind was torn between suspicion and hope. Alan noticed. "I'm not here to sell you anything or make empty promises. I just want to talk. Can I come in?" Vanessa appeared at the door, tying her robe and frowning. "Who is it?" "Mom, this is the guy who saw me rapping yesterday." Alan smiled, extending his hand. "Alan Moore. Pleased to meet you, ma'am. I saw your son yesterday and, well, he caught my attention. I just wanted to talk to him, see if he's interested in developing this. Training, recording a demo, maybe. Getting into a bigger circuit." Vanessa crossed her arms. She was tired of promises. People had already knocked on that door offering the world in exchange for minor abuses. She looked at George, then at Alan. And she decided, 5 minutes. Just talk. They sat in the kitchen between stacked aluminum plates and a thermos of lukewarm coffee. "George, you have a rare talent. It's not just the rhymes, it's the weight of the words, the way you hold the microphone, the way you hold the silence. I've seen that a few times, and I've been working with this for 20 years. Anis, what do you want from me? George asked, still cautious. I want to help you be heard, but that takes time. It takes effort. First, I need you to record a demo. Nothing professional yet, just your voice. I have a small studio in a warehouse. It's simple but functional. I can take you there if you want. George looked at his mother. She still seemed suspicious, but there was also something different in her gaze, a reflection of restrained pride. Can I think about it? Of course, here's my card. No pressure. I just wanted to say that I saw you, and that you have something. Alan got up and said goodbye. Vanessa, still standing, waited until the door closed. Do you trust him? She asked. I don't know. But for the first time, like someone important saw me. He listened to me. She nodded slowly, thoughtfully. Just don't forget where you came from, Gigi, or why you started. The next day, George went to the address written on the card. It was a simple but clean warehouse. Modest equipment, a makeshift booth. Alan greeted him with a glass of water and a serene smile. Ready to record? George took a deep breath, entered the booth, and put on his headphones. The beat started. You can start whenever you want, Alan said through the glass window. George closed his eyes, and for the first time, he recorded his voice. Not on his cell phone, not hidden in his room, but in a studio. Even if it was small, even if it was simple. He left the booth with sweaty hands. That was great, Alan said, listening to the first few tracks. Really, really. Now the real work begins. George left the studio with a copy of the recording in his hands. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew one thing. He was no longer invisible. He had left his voice in the world, and the world was beginning to respond. George returned from the studio with headphones on, but this time, it was his own voice he heard. Hearing himself truly rhyming, without the muffled sound of his cell phone or the noise of the fan in his room, was like finally being able to see himself from the outside. For the first time, he felt that maybe, just maybe, it was possible, but reality still pulled him back down. His mother's debt hadn't disappeared. The rent was still overdue. The refrigerator was showing signs of wear again, and the loan shark. Well, he didn't like to wait. Fear lived in that house like an old tenant, difficult to evict. Vanessa noticed her son's silence. While he stirred the reheated rice, headphones still around his neck, she sat down across from him. Is everything okay? Yeah, I don't know. She waited. George knew he could lie. Say he was just tired, but he didn't want to. The recording turned out well. Alan said that tomorrow we'll try to refine the 2 demos. That's great. Yeah. But what if it doesn't work out, Mom? What if it's all just an illusion? Meanwhile, the debt is still there. The rent is still there. She held his hand firmly, but without squeezing. Gigi, nothing changes overnight. And you don't have to save everything yourself. You already do more than any other kid your age. Much more. George lowered his eyes. It weighed heavily on him. But it was also true. The next morning, a message arrived on his cell phone. I have a delivery for you today. I'll pay double. Urgent. He hesitated. He knew what that meant. Bigger package, bigger risk. But the money from the delivery could help prevent the power from being cut off again. The meeting point was a square near downtown, a place busy enough to go unnoticed. As he approached the appointed time, George stopped. His cell phone vibrated, in his pocket with short, impatient messages. He looked around. People walking, cars passing by, a mother pushing a stroller. He felt something. A discomfort. A bad feeling. Too many people watching him, or maybe it was just paranoia. But he didn't want to take any chances. Not that day. With the beating still fresh in his memory, with his mother's voice still echoing. You don't have to save everything yourself. George turned around. He went straight to the studio, the package still in his backpack, his heart heavy, but his voice steady. Alan was surprised but didn't ask. The two spent the afternoon adjusting verses, aligning beats, cutting noise. George concentrated like never before. He was different, as if that heavy backpack was a reminder that either he threw himself into music for good, or he would be pulled back. The next morning, Alan sent another message. "Your demo yesterday was awesome. I showed it to someone. He wants to meet you." George felt the ground recede, but he still had a weight on his back. Literally. He needed, to resolve that. On the same corner as always, he found the package guy. The guy leaning against a dirty car, tattooed arm, cap pulled down. "Hey, Gigi, playing smart?" George froze. "My client said he didn't receive the package yesterday. Are you trying to rip me off, man?" George swallowed hard. He slowly took the backpack off his back and opened it. "No, I got scared. I had a bad feeling. People were looking at me differently on the bus. I thought it was better not to risk it. I went home with the package. It's here. Intact. No one touched it." The man looked at the package, then at George. "I don't like losses. I understand, but I can't do this anymore. I'm involved in a music thing now. I'm betting everything on it. Seriously, I don't want any trouble. I don't want any bullshit." The guy was silent for a moment. Then he smiled. But it wasn't a good smile. "No one stops once they get into this. You made your choice back then, Gigi. And if you try to get out, I know where your mother works." George froze, but he didn't answer. He just handed over the package and turned around. He walked away without looking back, blood pulsing in his ears, his throat tight. He didn't know what that warning meant, but he knew he couldn't back out now. When he got home, Vanessa was leaving for work. She saw her son's face more serious than usual. "Everything okay?" George simply replied, "Now it will be." That night, lying in bed with his headphones on, George heard his own voice rhyming again. But this time he felt no fear, no anger. He felt hope. Maybe, just maybe, he was close to something big. The clock on the restaurant wall read 3:03 p.m. when Vanessa felt the air change. It was one of those muggy days when even the kitchen fan couldn't push the heat away. She cleaned the counter with automatic movements, too tired to think. Another shift beginning, another day without knowing if her salary would be enough to make it through the month. That's when he walked in, calm, discreet, like any other customer. Dark coat, discreet silver necklace, hair carefully combed back. But his eyes didn't match the rest. They were cold, empty, the kind that don't look away. Vanessa recognized him immediately, the man who had promised to help when the heater broke and the rent threatened eviction. The same man who spoke softly but made her tremble inside. She tried to maintain her composure. She forced a smile. "Good afternoon. Would you like the menu?" He sat down at the counter, crossed his arms and replied in a low, almost soft voice. "I've already chosen, Vanessa. I've come to collect what you owe me." The cloth she was holding almost slipped from her hand. She pretended not to understand. Sir, You think you can string me along?" He interrupted her, still in that calm tone. "The amount has gone up. The debt is now 8,100, rate 100, Vanessa." Her eyes widened in surprise. "What? But I already paid you more than I borrowed. I told you, it's all or nothing. You didn't pay me everything twice and the debt tripled. I want my money or I know where your son goes to. School." The sentence cut like a knife. Vanessa felt the blood drain from her face. Her throat went dry. She tried to stay calm, but her hand trembled as she held the cloth on the counter. "Please, I just need a little more time." "He's trying. So hard, we're trying." The man leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on her. "I am patient, but even patience has its limits. And yours is running out, $8,100. I want it all. No excuses." He took a $5 bill out of his pocket and placed it on the counter as if it were a friendly gesture. "For the coffee," he said, and he walked away without looking back. Vanessa remained standing, as if unable to move. The noise of the stove in the kitchen, the customers' orders, the cutlery clattering on the tables, everything seemed distant, muffled, as if she had dived underwater. Inside, despair screamed. Outside, there was only silence. That night, Vanessa arrived home early. George was waiting for her with a simple meal, rice with egg and a slice of bread. She smiled on the outside, but inside she could still hear the loan shark's words echoing. "Is everything okay?" he asked, noticing his mother's lost gaze. "Yes, it's just the heat that's tiring," she replied quickly. Before the truth slipped out, they sat down. They ate in silence, and deep down they knew there was something unsaid between them. But sometimes pain hides in what is left unsaid. And in that house, words were economized like gas. That morning, Vanessa cried softly in the bathroom, as she had done since George was little, and George, on the other side of the wall, heard her. But he pretended not to, not out of weakness, but out of respect. Because sometimes, silence is the only form of love left when life leaves no room for anything else. George woke up with a dry throat and a heavy heart. The day dawned gray and muggy, as if the air were waiting for a storm that had not yet arrived. But for him, the storm was already inside the house. Vanessa had woken up before him. She was making coffee, but her eyes were sunken, her skin tired, her shoulders slumped. When George sat down at the table, she didn't smile. She just pulled up a chair and took a deep breath. "Son, I need to tell you something." George felt a tightness in his chest. "Yesterday, the loan shark showed up at the restaurant. He said that if I don't pay, he'll do something to you. He said it in no uncertain terms. I know where your son goes to school." George froze. His stomach churned. "The debt has tripled. Now it's 8,100. What?" "Yes, Gigi," he said. "Vanessa, it's all or nothing. You haven't paid me in full twice, and the debt has tripled." "Gigi, he won't accept half the money, and he kept all the money we already gave him." George was silent for a few seconds. Then he spoke, unable to hide his indignation. "That's impossible. We'll never be able to pay all that." Vanessa ran her hand over her eyes, trying to hide her tears. "I just wanted to protect you, but I don't know what to do anymore." He stood up slowly, swallowing his anger. He wanted to scream, he wanted to punch the wall, but he couldn't. Not in front of her. She was already hurting too much. "It'll be okay, I promise." Vanessa stared at him, surprised by the firmness in his tone, but he had already decided that he would not share any more anguish at that moment. He didn't tell her that 2 days earlier, he had been threatened by another man, the delivery man. A new meeting took place behind an old newsstand after a message was received on Gigi's cell phone. It was the guy with the package. He thought he would receive another delivery. He even planned to ask for an advance. Maybe with that, he could start paying off his debt to the loan shark. He thought he was doing the right thing, but as soon as he saw the look on the man's face, he realized he was wrong. Gigi arrived saying, "I'm back. I've thought it over." The delivery man didn't smile. "You've thought it over wrong, Gigi. I don't trust you anymore, and I told you I won't take a loss. You owe me $3,000 for the package you didn't deliver. You have a week to get me my money." George froze. The delivery man turned his back and walked away without another word. George remained motionless. Now he had 2 debts, 2 death threats, and no way out. It was the end of the line for George. All hope was gone. His phone rings. "It's Alan, Gigi. Go to the address I sent you. You have to be there at 2 p.m. The biggest producer in Atlantis wants to see you, so don't forget the demos. Gigi, hurry up and meet Alan." His stomach was still churning, but he pretended everything was normal. When he got there, Alan greeted him with a pat on the shoulder and an excited smile. "Ready to change your life?" George just nodded affirmatively. Marcus welcomed them into a room lined with acoustic panels with low lighting and speakers lined up. Without further ado, he asked for the flash drive with the tracks. George handed it over, still not knowing how to keep his body calm. Marcus put on his headphones, closed his eyes, and listened with professional attention. When he finished, he remained silent for a few seconds. Then he took off his headphones and looked straight at George. "This has truth, it has pain, it has identity. It's raw, it's clean, it's art. George couldn't hide his relief, but Marcus's gaze remained serious. "Listen, I can't promise you a contract right now, but I have a proposal." George leaned in, attentive. "In 2 days, there's going to be a private show. The owner of the record label will be there, and I need a new attraction, someone who can impress him. If he likes it, 50,000 reais and a contract with the biggest record label in Atlantida. It's your chance." George swallowed hard. He thought to himself, "It's more than I could have imagined. 50,000? That's right, but you have to be real. You on stage as if it were your last chance." "I'm in." "Then that's it. We'll rehearse, put together a set list. You just have to be yourself, nothing else." On the way home, George no longer heard the cars or the noise of the city, only the sound of his own footsteps and the beating of his heart. Now he had 2 debts, 2 threats, but also a golden opportunity. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slip away. The dressing room was small, but the reflection in the mirror seemed to occupy the entire world. George wore a black jacket and a shirt of the same color, recently purchased with the money Alan had given him. For the first time, he saw himself in a different light, not as a boy trying to survive, but as someone about to transform his story. Outside, the concert hall was buzzing, dim lights, tables occupied by businessmen, producers, scouts. In the middle of the audience, 2 familiar and unwanted faces were also there. The loan shark, in a wrinkled blazer and with a cold stare, and the delivery man, leaning discreetly against a side pillar, arms crossed, like a guard dog waiting to collect. Both knew what they wanted: money. Gigi knew what he needed to deliver: his soul. Marcus entered the dressing room with his cell phone in hand. "Are you ready?" Gigi took a deep breath. His chest was tight but steady. "Ready." On the big screen, the name appeared: Gigi. The sound of the initial applause was swallowed by an eerie silence, as if the audience sensed something big was coming. The bass kicked, deep, dense. The world stopped. George entered the stage without a hood, without fear, without masks. He carried the weight of 2 threats, of a forgotten childhood and of an entire neighborhood that wanted to breathe. And he rhymed. He rhymed with the anger of someone who was tired of being invisible, with the tenderness of someone who just wanted to save his mother, with the urgency of someone who has a single bullet and cannot miss the target. Verse after verse, Gigi rose, not above the audience, but above the pain, and in the end, silence. Seconds that seemed like hours. The record label owner stood up. Steady applause. Then the others followed. Applause burst like heavy rain on a tin roof. Gigi bowed his head, his eyes watering. Backstage, Marcus hugged him tightly. "You did it." He showed him his cell phone. "Contract approved. $50,000 available Monday. Bring Gigi." George exhaled as if he had been underwater for years. As he left, he saw that the 2 men were still there. The loan shark did not applaud. The delivery man just stared at him, but now it was different. Gigi walked past them as if stepping firmly on ground that had previously been sinking. He said nothing, nor should he have. He had something stronger than fear. He had a choice. That night, George came, home with his jacket still smelling new and a different silence in his footsteps. Vanessa was awake, her eyes sunken, holding the remote control turned off. He dropped his backpack, sat down next to her, and said, "Mom, no one will ever threaten you again, and you will never be in need again." She looked at him with a heart, broken into 1,000 pieces, and cried. He took a deep breath and said to her, "I'm the newest artist at Atlantida Records," and she smiled like never before in her life. Gigi didn't just survive. Gigi became a legend. If you liked today's story, leave a like and write your story in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss the next stories.